Okay. In the current news, we got news that Liz Cheney was defeated by the Republicans in the primary that was held in Wyoming yesterday. And regardless of your politics, it really brings into question when somebody strongly believes in something, whether they yield themselves to the crowd or stand on their principle. And Liz Cheney at least states verbally that she in principle believes that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. And despite the crowd, the Republicans removing her from office for taking that stand, she held on to that principle. Now, we may agree with her or we may not agree with her, but tonight we're going to look at about a man that didn't stand on his principle, but yielded to the crowd. And so we're going to talk about the sixth hearing that Jesus had before he was given over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. And this sixth hearing is the final hearing that Jesus had before Pilate. And we're going to look at what happened. This is the Bible in this area is history. These are historical figures of a historical event that took place that resulted in Jesus Christ being taken to the cross and crucified. So we're going to focus on the end of chapter 18 and the beginning first 15 verses of chapter 19 of the Gospel of John. But we're also going to look at Luke 23, 15 through 20, which is Luke's account of Jesus's reappearance before Pilate a second time. Now, it's been a while since we've talked about the events that preceded this sixth hearing that Jesus had. So I just will do a quick review. Over the past few weeks, we have been studying the events leading to the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. We were looking at the events that took place after midnight, Friday morning, for about the first 6 or so hours of Friday, on the day that at the evening of Friday, Passover would start. Jesus was taken into custody. He was arrested during the early morning hours on Friday before the celebration of Passover later that evening. He was arrested by armed soldiers and officials sent by the high priest and the Pharisees, who were led into the Garden of Gethsemane by Judas, who had been taken over by Satan and received a bribe to betray Jesus. We know that Jesus purposely allowed himself to be arrested in order to fulfill the Old Testament prophecies and to carry out God's will to complete God's plan of redemption and salvation. Jesus was taken before the Jewish leaders who, after 3 hearings, found that Jesus was guilty of blasphemy and sentenced Jesus to death, even though there were no credible evidence that Jesus had committed any crime whatsoever, and that Jesus was telling the truth about being the Son of God. Now, because the religious leaders did not want to be held responsible for putting Jesus to death on the eve of Passover, they decided to take Jesus to the Roman governor, Pilate, demanding that Pilate have Jesus executed under Roman law instead of stoning Jesus to death under Levitical law. Tonight, we're really going to get a feeling for the efforts of just about everybody to pass the buck so that somebody would be held responsible for putting Jesus to death, but none of them wanted to take responsibility for putting Jesus to death. After examining Jesus, Pilate told the religious leaders who brought Jesus to him that he found no basis for executing Jesus. However, the religious leaders continued to pressure Pilate to carry out their demands to crucify Jesus. When Pilate learned that Jesus was from Galilee, which was under the jurisdiction of Herod and Antipas, he sent Jesus to Herod. Herod refused to take Jesus seriously and asked Jesus to perform miracles and signs to satisfy Herod's curiosity. When Jesus remained silent and did not respond to Herod, Herod joined the crowd and mocked and ridiculed Jesus by dressing Jesus in a royal robe, insulted Jesus, and having his guards abuse Jesus before sending him back to Pilate. Pilate's attempt to avoid being held responsible for executing Jesus or deciding Jesus's fate by sending Jesus to Herod failed, and Jesus was brought back before Pilate a second time, and that should be Pilate instead of Herod. So he tried to deflect responsibility for the decision to crucify Jesus by sending Jesus to Herod. Herod passed the ball back to Pilate and sent Jesus back to Pilate to appear before him a second time. In tonight's lesson, we will learn how Pilate unsuccessfully attempted to avoid responsibility for crucifying Jesus, but ended up acquiescing to the demands of the Jews. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that although Pontius Pilate was given a final opportunity to recognize who Jesus was and to release Jesus, he decided to protect his own interests and cowardly acquiesced to the demands of the Jewish leaders by turning Jesus over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. The study itself, the outline of the study is that Jesus appeared before Pilate a second time and is turned over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. The first part that we're going to focus on is Pilate unsuccessfully sought to avoid being held responsible for crucifying Jesus. The second thing that we're going to discuss is Pilate fearfully rejected Jesus as the Son of God and decided to protect his own interests instead of releasing Jesus. The third part is that Pilate cowardly acquiesced to the demands of the Jews. And then we'll have, following our previous format, some discussion questions and then conclude with implications, conclusions, and applications. So let's get into the study itself. Jesus appeared before Pilate a second time and is turned over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. At the end of chapter 18 of the book of the Gospel of John, verse 40, the crowd shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now, Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. We're going to talk about how during Passover, the Roman governors started a tradition of releasing a prisoner at the request of the Jews, and how the Jews, in this case, asked for the release of Barabbas instead of releasing Jesus. So we're going to get into when Jesus was returned to him, Pilate unsuccessfully sought to avoid being held responsible for crucifying Jesus. When Herod returned Jesus to Pilate, Pilate was tormented because he recognized that there was no cause for Jesus being put to death, but he was being pressured by the chief priests and the religious leaders to carry out their demands for Jesus to be crucified. Pilate was really a troubled individual. This was not one of the better days of his life because he was being pulled both ways. Pilate had received a message from Herod that Herod had agreed with him and found that there was no basis for Jesus being put to death. But in addition, Pilate's wife had sent him an urgent message admonishing Pilate not to have anything to do with condemning Jesus. We find that in Matthew chapter 27, verse 19. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." With all the other things going on, the last thing that Pilate wanted to hear is an omen from a dream sent by his wife telling him, "Wash your hands of this. Don't have anything to do with condemning this innocent man." Now, how was Pilate divided here? As a judicial officer, Pilate recognized his responsibility to dispense justice and release Jesus, who he found not guilty of committing any offense which justified Jesus being put to death. As a governor of the province of Judea, Pilate recognized the prospect of facing an uprising if he did not do what the Jews were demanding of him. On one hand, as a judicial officer, he found that Jesus was not guilty and he was not comfortable with sentencing an innocent man to death. On the other hand, as a governor of Judea, if he didn't do what the Jews demanded, he was worried about an uprising, calling in Roman troops. This would get back to the Caesar, and it would reflect badly on him and on his ability to administer the province of Judea. In order to avoid being held responsible for ordering the death of a man who he found to be innocent, again, this should be Pilate, not Herod, made 3 unsuccessful attempts to have the religious leaders drop their demands for him to crucify Jesus. The question that is not really raised in the scriptures, but it just is out there, is why didn't Pilate just release Jesus? Well, we have an inference that he was worried about the crowd and an uprising, but Pilate decided to try and get the Jews to back off from their demands. The first thing, he did 3 different things. The first thing he tried to do is he tried to follow the practice of having a prisoner released at Passover, and he offered to release Jesus instead of Barabbas. So in the end of chapter 18,
Barabbas.
I'm going to do it. Barabbas. Thank you. Once you start stumbling on a word, Pastor, it's hard to get back into groove. Okay. So with this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against him, speaking of Jesus, but it is your custom for me to release you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? According to Mark, Barabbas was a notorious prisoner who had taken part in a rebellion or insurrection against Rome. According to Jewish scholars, Barabbas, whose name is translated as son of the father, had committed murder in an uprising against Rome. It's interesting that his name is translated son of the father, and Jesus is son of the Father. And so in Mark 15, verses 6 or 11, he goes into more detail about this custom. Now, it was a custom of the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. So it's interesting because the crowd, the Jewish people in general, are the ones that went to Pilate asking him to follow the custom that had been practiced in the past. And Pilate was appealing to the crowd basically to go over the heads of the priests and request the release of Jesus. Perhaps Pilate was banking on that Jesus was still popular with the crowd, and it was the chief priests that were envious that wanted Jesus to die, not the crowd. He quickly found out that his assumption was not correct, because in the meantime, the priests had incited the crowd to demand that they crucify Jesus and release Barabbas. So this is something where he tried to escape being responsible for putting Jesus to death by appealing to the crowd, but the priests had gotten there first, inciting the crowd to go against Jesus. So that was his first attempt. The next thing, thinking that he could appease the chief priests and the religious leaders' thirst for blood, and hoping to put off making a final decision about Jesus's fate, Pilate ordered his soldiers to flog Jesus. In verse 1 of chapter 19, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flog. The Roman practice of flogging involved tying the prisoner to a whipping post and then exposing his back. The whip that was used by the Roman soldiers consisted of a long leather strap, and it was studded with bits of lead and sharpened pieces of bone. So you have this leather strap with lead and sharp bone embedded into the leather, and then strapped to the whipping post, Jesus would be whipped by the Roman soldiers. These whips did a terrible amount of damage, and it was torture. They tore the prisoner's flesh right to shreds. Jesus's back was completely shredded. There was no, unlike the Jewish whippings or floggings, which were limited to 39 whippings, there was no limit on the on the Roman soldiers whipping a prisoner. They could do it as long as they wanted. According to Jerome, Jesus endured being whipped by 6 different shifts of soldiers. In other words, they were whipping Jesus so hard that they had to take the soldiers that were doing the whipping and relieve them with other soldiers that came forward to do the whipping 6 times. Despite his unbearable suffering, Jesus survived. Most prisoners lost consciousness from the whippings or the floggings. Many died and others went insane. After Jesus was flogged, the soldiers made a crown of thorns, which they crammed down on Jesus's head, put a robe around him, and continued to beat him. In chapter 19, verses 2 and 3, John describes this. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then they struck him in the face. So after being flogged, Jesus is insulted by putting this crown on, and then the soldiers are mocking him, and then they're beating him with their fists in the face. After all of this, how Jesus just endured the flogging is one thing, but Pilate then presented Jesus before the crowd, hoping that when they saw the results of the flogging and the beatings, they would abandon their demand for Jesus to be crucified. Again, he was looking not only to appease the bloodthirstiness of the chief priests and the Pharisees, but he was also appealing to the crowd to say, enough is enough. This man has taken an awful lot, and hoping that they would turn their demand to have Jesus crucified into sympathy and compassion for a man that took such a beating. So in verses 4 and 5 of chapter 19, John describes, once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, "Here is the man." He's basically saying, look what we've done to this man. And he had hoped that the crowd would see the bleeding of Jesus, the suffering of Jesus, the Jesus' strength being taken away from him, that they would just drop their bloodthirstiness and have compassion. And by telling the crowd that here's the man, Pilate was unknowingly giving a prophetic message that Jesus as a man suffered for us through his humiliation and suffering so that we might receive glory or be glorified. Despite what the crowd observed, the Jews continued to demand that Jesus be crucified. Seeing Jesus beat like this, they said, as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." Again, the priests are leading the ways to incite the crowd for Jesus to be put to death. Those were the first 2 attempts by Pilate to try and get them to back off of their demands to have Jesus crucified. Finally, in disgust, Pilate offered to turn Jesus over to the crowd to crucify Jesus themselves. He's saying, this is disgusting. He's innocent. Look at him. And yet you still want to crucify him? Why don't you take him and crucify him? In verse 6, chapter 19, John writes, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis of a charge against him." Every single time Pilate is saying, this man is innocent. Think about what you're doing. And so he finally pleads to take responsibility off his shoulders for Jesus being crucified. He's saying, you take him and crucify him. If we go through the first time that Jesus appeared before Pilate and the second time that Jesus appears for Pilate, 6 times Pilate declared that there was no basis for Jesus being put to death or crucified. Pilate did not want to take part in a miscarriage of justice and tried to place responsibility of Jesus's death on the Jews and not on himself. Pilate did have a choice. He could have refused to yield to the demands of the Jews by releasing Jesus, or he could surrender to their demands. Instead, Pilate took a compromised position, trying to transfer the decision and the responsibility for Jesus' death to the Jews. Now, in response to Pilate's attempt to pass the buck back to the Jews, the Jewish leaders insisted that Jesus had broken their laws because Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. In verse 7 of chapter 19, John writes, the Jews insisted, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. Now, none of the writers about Pilate and none of the scriptures that describe Pilate ever described Pilate as a religious man. Pilate was not familiar. He was a Roman officer. He was a pagan. He was not familiar with the Old Testament of the Jews, and he did not recognize Jesus as the Son of God. But even though he didn't recognize the Old Testament and that the God of the Jewish people, he was familiar with and aware of the superstition that the Romans acquired from the Greek gods, where they believed that mythical gods would come to earth and interact with men. So he did have some notion about the existence of gods. It came from the Greeks. The Romans picked it up. In many cases, they changed their god from Neptune, which is a Roman name, to from the Greek names. And what we have here is a transfer of this Greek mythology that the Romans picked up. And Pilate was aware of that. So what Pilate heard from the Jewish leaders that Jesus, when he heard that the Jewish leaders claimed that Jesus was a son of God, he became terrified, believing that Jesus might indeed be one of these mythical gods who had come to earth. So he took Jesus back into his palace because he wanted to find out, in fear, asking who Jesus actually was. So John reports in his gospel that Pilate became afraid, which translated from the Greek meant that Pilate was terrified. In verse 8 of chapter 19, John writes, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Another translation is he was terrified, and he went back inside the palace. We get to this part now where Jesus is taken away from the crowd inside the palace, and Pilate fearfully rejected Jesus as the Son of God and decided to protect his own interests instead of releasing Jesus. When Pilate heard that the Jews said that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, Pilate took Jesus back inside his palace to find out who Jesus actually was and whether Jesus was one of the mythical gods who had come to earth. In verse 9 continued, John writes, Pilate asked Jesus, where do you come from? He asked Jesus. In asking this, Pilate meant, are you a man or a god? Do you come from earth or from heaven? Pilate is confused. He's terrified. He's not recognizing Jesus as being the son of the Jewish God. He's just terrified that Jesus might be one of these mythical gods. But Jesus remained silent and did not respond to Pilate's question. And the continuation of verse 9 and verse 10, John writes, but Jesus gave him no answer. And Pilate asked, do you refuse to speak to me? By the time he had taken Jesus back inside his palace, Pilate had already consciously or unconsciously rejected Jesus as the true Son of God. And he was only attempting to determine whether Jesus was one of the other pagan gods. When you choose a pagan god, you're not choosing Jesus as the Son of God. And Pilate, consciously or unconsciously, was looking at Jesus as not being a true Son of God, of the true God, but being a pagan god. And in doing so, he was rejecting Jesus. Pilate's decision to flog Jesus revealed that Pilate had already decided to reject the truth, and that Pilate's only concern was how to avoid being held responsible for Jesus's death. Pilate took a middle position. Even though he believed that Jesus was innocent, to try to appease the Jewish leaders and to try to get them to back off from wanting or demanding to crucify Jesus, he had Jesus brutally flogged. That in itself speaks of Pilate's not only indecision, but the lack of justice and his rejection of Jesus as the true Son of God. Pilate had been given ample opportunity to humble himself before Jesus and accept Jesus as the Son of God, but refused to do so. Jesus remained silent, closing the door to Pilate's salvation. This principle we've discussed in the past in previous lessons. When God goes silent, your chance or the opportunities for you to be given the gospel or to believe that have knowledge or wisdom about who Jesus is cut off. And Jesus's silence is symbolic of that Pilate's chances were cut off. Instead of releasing Jesus, Pilate arrogantly asserted his human authority over Jesus's life. Again, another sign that Pilate recognized Jesus as a man, or if he was a god, he was a mythical god. But Pilate is asserting his human authority over Jesus, which is a rejection of Jesus as God. In verse 10, continued on chapter 19, John writes, "Don't you realize that I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" Now, how ironic that Jesus, who held the absolute authority and power over life and death, was being told by Pilate that Pilate had held that authority and power over Jesus. And you can see from Jesus' response that Jesus put Pilate in his place. Jesus responded by telling Pilate that he had the authority and power, that the authority and power that Pilate claimed to possess was given by God and did not come from his position as a Roman governor. In verse 11 of chapter 19, John writes, Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Jesus is saying, the power that you're given doesn't come from you being a Roman governor, from you being in charge of Judea. It is because God allowed you to exercise that power over me. So now we have these attempts by Pilate to avert being responsible for Jesus's death. We have Pilate adding to his attempts to avert being responsible for Jesus' death. We have Pilate being superstitious and terrified about who Jesus really was. And now we're going to see where Pilate is forced to take a position. Pilate cowardly acquiesced to the demands of the Jews. Although Pilate tried to transfer the responsibility for Jesus' death to the Jews, he was the one who decided not to release Jesus, even though he tried to get the Jews to stop demanding that Jesus be crucified. The verse 12 says, "From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free." There's an emphasis in this short little sentence that Pilate was doubling down on his efforts to wash his hands, to release himself from being responsible to Jesus for Jesus's death. Let's see how he tried to do it. Despite Pilate's renewed efforts to avoid being held responsible for Jesus being put to death, he was intimidated by the Jews telling him that he's no friend of Caesar if he lets Jesus go. Verse 12, John writes, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." The Jews had just told Pilate that Jesus deserved to die under their laws because of blasphemy. Pilate's still trying to get out of making that tough decision. And now they're saying, okay, that didn't work. So you're no friend of Caesar if you let Jesus go, raising the fear that they're going to have a mob, an insurrection, that Pilate's position as governor of Judea would be jeopardized if he were to let Jesus go. When Pilate heard that the Jews were saying he became even more fearful of man than he was fearful of God. Pilate recognized that if he did not turn Jesus over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified, that the Jewish leaders would go over his head to Caesar, claiming that Pilate had not done anything to get rid of a king who was challenging Caesar's authority. He wasn't worried that Jesus was ever challenging Caesar's authority. He was worried that the Jewish people would go over his head like they did in the past go to Caesar and say, we had a man named Jesus who was claiming to be a king, who was an insurrectionist against Rome, and your governor in Judea did nothing about it. And Roman Caesars were always nervous about insurrections and treason. And so with Pilate's record, it was likely that Caesar would take punitive action against Pilate. Pilate's hands was forced. Pilate was forced to choose between which king he would serve. Any suggestion of an act of treason against Caesar would jeopardize Pilate's position and perhaps his own life. The Jews' intimidation of Pilate worked. Pilate was forced to publicly announce his decision to allow Jesus to be crucified. Pilate chose to serve and protect his position, his money, and his earthly status in relation to Caesar, and by doing so, Pilate forfeited his salvation and eternal life. Pilate didn't give up. As a last attempt to avoid being held responsible for Jesus being crucified, Pilate wanted the Jewish leaders to make the final decision. Again, he's trying to pass the buck to the Jewish people. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as a stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. You can go to Jerusalem today, and you can go to this stone pavement where Pilate sat when the crowd shouted, "Crucify Jesus," and it's still there. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here's your king," Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Pilate was trying to get the Jews to make the decision, "Shall I crucify your king?" Getting them to respond, "Crucify him, take him away." So he was trying to say that the Jews were responsible. In other scriptures and the other gospels, the Jewish leaders went on to say, "We'll take responsibility. It'll be on our heads and our children's heads for having Jesus put to death." But Pilate just acquiesced to them by just simply turning Jesus over to the Roman soldiers to crucify him. When by taking the seat of judgment, Pilate finally caved into the pressure of the crowd, knowing that they would continue to demand that Jesus be crucified. The crowd never stopped demanding that Jesus be crucified. Asking the crowd whether they want, do you want to crucify your king? He knew what their answer was going to be. They continuously demanded his crucifixion, trying to put the blame on the Jews and abdicate responsibility for Jesus' death. That was a futile, feeble attempt by Pilate. Pilate's final attempt to avoid personally being held responsible for Jesus' death was ineffective. He knew what the crowd wanted and how they would respond to the question about crucifying their king. By saying that they had no king but Caesar, the chief priests were committing blasphemy. As the anointed chief priests and religious leaders, the Jewish leaders knew that God was their king. Throughout the Old Testament, it's repeated that God is not only their Lord, but their king. And by saying that they have no king but Caesar, it was the Jewish leaders that were guilty of blasphemy, even though they were accusing Jesus of being blasphemy, and Jesus was the Son of God. So it's the irony that's built into this final trial of Jesus before Pilate is just manifest. And the attempt by the Jews to pass the buck to Pilate, by Pilate trying to pass the buck to anybody but Pilate, and how the ball kept on going back and forth. Not one person was thinking about God the Father, about Jesus being the Son of God. They were all doing the same thing. They are trying to protect their earthly treasures. They're trying to protect their earthly wealth, their earthly positions of power. and they never humbled themselves or yielded themselves to the authority of God. So with that, we conclude the 6 trials of Jesus, 3 before the Jewish leaders, 3 before the Gentile leaders, which ultimately resulted in the demand by the Jewish leaders in response to Pilate's question, do you want me to crucify your king? And they said, crucify him. And so now in the next study, what we're going to have is Jesus is taken by the Roman soldiers and he's taken outside the city of Jerusalem and crucified. So we're going to get into these discussion questions to and expand our understanding of these scriptures.
You're on.
When Jesus was first brought before Pilate, Pilate recognized that Jesus had not committed any offense which merited or justified Jesus being crucified. Pilate was troubled by his conscience because Pilate believed that Jesus was not guilty and that his death by crucifixion was not justified. Instead of refusing to do what the Jewish leaders asked of him and release Jesus, Pilate tried to avoid making any decision and attempted to avoid being the one who would be held responsible for Jesus's death. Repeatedly declaring Jesus as being not guilty, Pilate attempted to avoid making the decision to crucify Jesus by waiving the Roman law, which limited the authority to administer the death penalty to the Roman authorities, and allowing the Jewish leaders to take Jesus's life, by transferring the decision to Herod, by offering to release Jesus pursuant to the custom practiced by Roman governors at Passover, by trying to change the Jewish bloodthirsty appetite by having Jesus flogged, and by finally telling the Jews to take Jesus and crucify him themselves. Despite all his efforts to avoid being held responsible for Jesus' death, the crowd intimidated Pilate by threatening to take the matter to Caesar if Pilate did not do what the Jews demanded. Pilate was forced to make a choice between his earthly position and power of authority and status and the heavenly reward of salvation and eternal life. Having made a choice to protect his earthly interests, Jesus stood silent, allowing Pilate to suffer the consequences from not doing the right thing. Pilate's final attempt to have the decision made by the Jews and to avoid being held responsible for Jesus's death was disingenuous because Pilate's offer to allow the Jews to make the final decision for him was made known in advance that the Jews would demand that Jesus be crucified. The choice which was forced upon Pilate is a choice which everyone who is confronted by the truth of the gospel is forced to make. Do we choose to continue to pursue the earthly rewards of the flesh, or do we choose to believe that Jesus is the Son of God sent from heaven to bring us salvation and eternal life? Like Pilate, we may attempt to postpone making the decision for life and death, but once we encounter Jesus and the Word, we will be forced to make a decision. Either we choose life or suffer death. There's no middle compromise. As it is frequently said, either you're on the bus or you're not on the bus. When confronted by the decision on what to do about Jesus, Pilate never chose to do the right thing by releasing Jesus. He did everything he could to avoid getting on the bus.
Amen.
Very good. All right.